presenter is Dylan McCoy. Dylan is, and you can read it, but he's the lead wilderness ranger on the McKenzie River Ranger District, the Willamette National Forest. And uh, he's going to tell you a little bit more about him. But first, I would like to just comment that he has made his mark as an accomplished team leader. And part of what has made him successful is he's always seeking new and more effective ways to accomplish goals and to introduce teams to a fulfilling profession. So I'll let Dylan take it away a little bit about himself and then proceed with what we think is a really cool and somewhat familiar, somewhat new way to build a great team for your season.
Great. Thank you, Risa. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Again, my name is Dylan McCoy. I work here as the lead wilderness ranger on the Willamette National Forest McKenzie River Ranger District. And today we're going to introduce a different idea for thinking about building successful wilderness teams. This suggested framework is for planning in general and problem solving specifically for leaders, but also folks who might consider themselves to be non-leaders are going to find portions of this that are effective and helpful too. I'd like to say a little bit about this. When Risa first approached me about doing this, her and I really clicked on the idea. I've been thinking that some alternative approaches to leadership might be in store. And since then, there have been some other products that I have seen put out by the Forest Service specifically that have started to present different ways to think about how you approach different situations, being part of a team, part of a crew, and how to make those effective. So I'm going to reference some of that throughout today too, and some of the new approaches that we're considering. But I hope to hear back from you and some of what you thought after today. And this is always in progress and evolution. So be curious to see what folks think and how they feel about it. Next slide, please. So we have our traditional approach to problem solving, right? That a lot of us are familiar with. Essentially looking at clarifying the issue, creating a brainstorm session with the folks that are involved and using the information there to develop a plan and then implementing that plan. When I looked at this slide at first, I thought, well, this is kind of at best. Some people don't even do a lot of these steps, but this is kind of one of our idyllic ways to solve problems and more traditional approach that people are pretty familiar with. I'd say that this is better than no planning at all, but sometimes that's what people utilize, is just kind of go into it and I'll feel it out when I get there. So we're going to be talking about an approach that's slightly different than this coming up. So it's called design thinking, right? And design thinking is a bit different from that approach in two major ways that I'll point out. First off, you can see in that slide that empathizing is a first step in this, right? And I just want to define this because people get this term mixed up sometimes with other meanings. So empathy is the capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing from within that person's frame of reference, right? So different than sympathizing and feeling like good or bad for or with that person, empathy is your ability to put yourself in their shoes, so to speak. Can you see what they're seeing from their perspective? We'll talk more about this approach, but it's really important to think about this first. And the other major way this is different is the prototype and test piece. So we'll get to that in a second. Your next step is going to be defining the problem. So that is similar to the traditional approach in that you're really going to try and look at what is the problem by itself and not make it more than it is or less than it is. Next is to create the ideas, right? What are the ideas that we have, similar to the brainstorming session, for how to solve the situation that you're in? And then next is prototype. So that's a little bit different than the implementing that we looked at the traditional model, right? Prototype is thinking about creating something that you're going to try out, right? What is an idea and how can it work, versus implementing it and then just kind of seeing what happens afterwards. And then you got to test it, right? Testing the essential idea, the prototype or prototypes that you've created, is a little bit different than the implement model that we're used to. This takes more time usually, but it can help remove some of the consequences involved in the failure of the implementation. Without testing, failure can become an adverse kind of idea, versus in the prototype and test model, we like to actually approach it with the idea of failure, because failure can lead to a more solid success at the end of the day. So instead of just talking about that by itself, let's walk through this. And to start things off, we want to learn a bit about us, the folks that are here. So we're going to jump over to a Jamboard here in a minute and have you guys start participating. And what we'd like to know is, where do you call home? What is your superpower? And what groups do you associate with? And how might this affect your ability to contribute to your team, right? So some of these questions start to get the idea of empathizing with your crew or with your audience. So let's go ahead and jump right on over to that Jamboard, if you may.
You can find a sticky note and just say why you are awesome.
That's a great superpower, keeping a cool head in a crisis. What's great about looking at this is you put a lot of this together, and that's pretty super. That's a lot of powers. I like too, we got some of the traditional approaches to superpower, and I see strength and vulnerability, right? That's an interesting one too. We'll talk more about that. Okay, great. Much like your cruise, it's going to be across the board. People are going to have different superpowers. And tuning into what those are, right? Giving a sense for when they're being challenged and when they're in their zone.
Okay,
This is
now
awesome.
I think we're going to go ahead to the next question. It was on that slide.
So what groups do you associate with, and how might this affect your ability to contribute to your team? So think about what's your community. It's great. One of the groups I associate with is musicians, and specifically drummers who've drummed for a long time. Awesome. Forest Service workers, Society of American Foresters, great. Feral and wild, I hope we get some of that in here. That's perfect. The photo post. You've been on my crew in the last 17 years. You know, I harp on it over and over. Photos worth 1,000 words, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, some conservation, outdoors, hiking and backpacking, water sports. All these are great. Recent college grad, congratulations. So you can get a sense looking at all this, right? How many different kinds of groups, different superpowers, different places people are from. a lot of differences that we have to think about when we think about empathizing. And there will be lots of similarities that you'll find too. This step is something that can be overlooked, right? Traditional model hasn't really always focused on knowing your audience and how best to work with them. This is going to be great.
And now we can go back to our problem, figuring that out.
Your new perspective. I was trying to read that really tight one. Okay, great. So then give you a sense of what to think about when you're talking with your crews out there, how to get, these are just 3 examples, but really trying to get a sense for where they're coming from. So as you guys move forward in your projects, you can be successful. So here we go. We have an issue that some of us might be familiar with, that we've probably seen in wilderness, outside wilderness. So defining the issue at this point, right? So what is the actual problem? So in the chat, please, if you can, describe the situation we might encounter. And put your notes in the chat and add any comments about the relevant circumstances you've encountered or anticipate that relate to these photos. Consider the patterns and insights around the circumstances. Question your assumptions before you label them as facts, right? So we have assumptions about this, but what is the actual issue going on here? So wilderness folks, let's just say it's in the wilderness setting. Yeah, so we're seeing vandalism, maybe a lack of education, maybe a lack of respect, damage. Okay.
Uninformed. Feeling a little angry.
So damage is one that comes up a lot too. And remember the empathy piece. So just the same as we're doing within our groups, you might think too that if a person's standing carving something into a tree with a heart around it, they might not have been thinking damage, even though our perspective might be damage. Yeah, enjoyment for the user, even though wrong. Interesting. So we start to define the scope, and we'll take these responses and then we'll come back and see if folks are sticking with their definition or have changed their minds over time.
Too much time on my hands.
So I think we head to the next slide. Okay, so now we've talked about the problem a bit, right? We're starting to narrow it down. What are some ideas for how we might go about rectifying it? So I think we're going to head back to the Jamboard so we can start to share some of those ideas with each other a little bit more visually. And I'll say with my crews, this happens a lot, this whole process of how do we define this issue? What really is the problem? And then that has to lead to what the ideas for the solution is. If we don't get a good definition, our ideas for the solution are going to be all across the map. All right, public contacts, education. Let's see, a visitor logbook. So there's something else to make a mark on. Interesting. You can start to see from some of these that people are defining differently what the problem is and how to address it. Social media post. All right. Leave no trace. Yeah. Chaseless signs. Sorry, I'm leaning in. Some of the wordy ones are hard to see.
And one was clear expectations of wilderness behavior involved in the issuance of wilderness permits.
Designated lover's lane, maybe rope it off. Finding finding an alternative uh, outlet is one of my favorites. Educate the individual. Signage posted at common problem areas. FPOs or LEOs. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, great. You can see it's a lot of similarities and you get some of the creativity. But look at this. This is, we got a crew of folks here thinking of all these different problems. Man, right? Like not everybody's thought is the same, but look at all these different options. You think if you can get this many options, you can probably tackle anything. Yeah, patrols and education. Good. It's interesting. I don't see anybody posting anything about fixing the actual trees themselves. More fixing the source. Super, super interesting our perspectives and how we think about going about it. My first thought, I thought, wow, I wonder if someone will put in fall the tree so you don't see the marks anymore. A tree will be historic in 50 years and then not a problem, huh? All right. I think we got a good amount of, still a few more coming in, but that was great.
Okay.
We had a lot of problems. I think we can move, or a lot of ideas, but I think we can move on from there.
Okay.
So then you take those ideas, right, and do a prototype. So instead of maybe just hanging our laurels on, well, let's just follow the tree so nobody sees the damage. Maybe we want to like test it out and see if we can do it. So I saw a lot of education in there. The lover's lane idea was cool. Patrols, enforcement of regs. Some of that could be tested outside of the area. Some might have to be tested within the area. But the prototype idea allows you to think about it as a test, right? This is just a prototype. We're going to try this out and then see if it's effective or if it's not effective. Let me see here. Don't worry about the answer being the perfect answer. Though when you make a prototype, you want to give it your best effort. So thinking big, acting small, failing fast. And some traditional teaching has led us to avoid the idea of failure. And avoiding failure means that we don't learn to improve upon the failures, right? So we're trying to avoid it. Failure is almost a must if you're going to improve. If you never fail, there won't be a whole lot of reason to make an improved outcome or prototype. So I encourage folks to think about practicing the prototype method with the idea that it probably won't work the first time, but at least you'll know what you tried and how it did or didn't work. So we go to the test. Where will we give this a try at? When will we put this to the test and for how long? Evaluate the test, gather the info on it, and hey, if it worked, awesome. Is it going to work here and not elsewhere? Is it going to be an isolated incident? Is it going to be something that you can spread out to other user groups and share about how you solved it, right? In this case, it might be if you're testing something on the tree itself, is it species dependent? Is it area dependent? So give it a test, and then you take that idea from the test phase, and then you might start over again. Excuse me. So did it work, right? Refine, iterate, scale, or start over. If you followed the process, you shouldn't have to resort to starting over, but sometimes you can feel confident enough that say that, hey, maybe I made some assumptions at the beginning that weren't necessarily accurate about what the problem is. So you might want to start over again and redefine and go back to this phase. I say this because then it starts to allow us to be okay with the idea that we might not get it the first time, but getting it at all is sometimes pretty rare, right? Sometimes some of these issues like this can be hard to achieve. How do we get folks? It's so easy to do to carve into a tree, and it's so long lasting. How do we actually make an effective difference on something like this? So I think it's a great example of something that really is going to involve a good amount of failure before we get a really defined answer that can be utilized on a broader scale. So similar to a lot of how we work with our crews, right? Um, it's going to take some testing and working with folks to figure out what's really going to be an effective way for us to operate in the long term. So it's a great example, and you can think about it in terms of like being a leader. Think about this, you can think about it as a science experiment. And I want to share with you something I heard recently, which is that most funding for science goes into the initial research. Right. So you think about science and a lot of what we hang our laurels on in terms of scientific research today. A lot of folks who apply for that funding get the funding for the initial research period of science. The real test for science's viability, right, the findings of it, is if that test can be duplicated somewhere else. Not a lot of funding opportunities for retesting and duplicating scientific experiments that have already been done. It's not as flashy as the original test and the results that you get. So recent investigations into this has found that when they do start to test a lot of scientific experiments that we know about and have said, hey, science says X, they're finding they're not, a lot of them, more than we'd like to admit, aren't able to be duplicated. And so that hasn't really come about recently because, right, the funding was for the original testing, not for testing the test. So it's worth thinking about that when you get into this too, is that you may be able to set up your own experiment and remember too that, hey, if someone else can do it in a similar way that you did it and get the same results, your solution might be pretty solid. And if not, they're finding a flaw in it that you guys can help solve together. You might have found it a different way later. Next slide. Okay. So I know a lot of you are thinking about, okay, this might apply to me as a leader of a crew, but I want to turn it around too and think about it from a crew member's standpoint. So the process, in my opinion, isn't just about being a leader of a crew, but also what FIRE is calling followership to leadership. There's a lot of other terms for it, but supporting your lead and identifying those opportunities within yourself to work well as a crew member. Oops. Thank you. Yeah, next slide. So here's the model, right? Empathize, define, create the ideas, set up the prototype, and test it out. Like I said, even leaders work under other leaders. So even folks who are typically in that leadership role typically have someone else that they may report to or that's helping lead them in a certain way. And so understanding how to bring this model and push it upwards is also super important. And we're going to talk about an example here of how to do that. So starting at the beginning of the process, empathizing. So here's just a few photos that you can look at to get an idea of, all right, in this situation, not being the leader, but seeing how the leader might be behaving in this situation. How can you relate to maybe what they're going through? So in the traditional model that we're taught, leaders tend to be able to empathize with crew because they were at one point part of the crew, right? Part of the folks following leadership. So they can look back and go, okay, I was in that place before. I can remember where I was when that happened. Tends to be a little bit harder if you're part of a crew and haven't led a crew before, right? But you still can get a sense of what leaders are going through. There's a lot to manage, a lot of things to think about on their plate. Um, and in the best situations, they're trying their best, but they might not see everything. They might not know everything. We're all just humans after all. So we got a photo here of a crosscut situation, right? In the middle, you got a big crew of folks. Looks like they just accomplished something successfully and left there. Maybe that's the tree after the cut. You got some folks in the middle working on looks like a fire ring and a project, and maybe some stream restoration down there in the bottom right. So hopefully some of those photos you guys can think about maybe having an experience with, or maybe this summer you will have an experience with that situation. But keep that idea of empathy in mind. And go to the next slide. So here's going to be our sample situation. Do a medical emergency situation. So think about the lead in a medical emergency situation. You're part of a crew and a medical happens when you're out there. All right. What's a lead likely going to be doing? Probably taking a role in helping the medical situation directly. In that situation, sometimes a lead can get tunnel vision, right? Focusing on the issue right in front of them, and there might be stuff going on around the margins. So as you empathize with that leader, just understand that they have so much going on their plate, even if they might not be addressing something, you might be able to see that and help them in a certain way. So defining that, right? So you have an idea of what they're addressing, but what else could be going on in the situation? So we might jump back here to the Jamboard in a second and throw down some ideas about if the lead is taking the lead on managing a medical, what else might be going on? How do we define the situation and start to create some ideas about what might be happening?
First, we're going to take a look at, again, these pictures of the group scenarios and
Jumped ahead.
just, yeah. Is this familiar? Is this foreign? Is this fun? Is this
Yep, seeing the good life, the big cruise, rewarding work, teamwork.
nostalgia and empathetic back pain?
Lots of cheese and peanut butter. Yep, someone's been there before. Yeah, someone with a lot of experience in our line of work, seen a lot of familiarity with what they've experienced. Great.
That's your crew. We'll move on to the situation. We went.
What's awesome is all this stuff is right. People bonding. Wanting a blue helmet. Sure, disconnecting. Okay, great. We've got a lot of good answers here. Smelling terrible after 8 days. I can empathize.
Shall we go to the situation, Dylan?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
head on over. All right, so back to the situation we're talking about in the medical. So we're defining the issue, right? So the medical situation is defining itself. What else do folks anticipate maybe seeing going on there? Particularly, what might the lead miss? Okay, perfect. We got some folks. Good, yeah. Incoming bad weather. Situational awareness. That's one of our terms for sure. Crowd control. Yep. Sounds like we have some folks who've been in this situation before. Stressing the crew or bystanders. Yeah, totally. Damaging the ecology of the habitat. Some PTSD, right? Folks might have a hard time. Your crew members might be having a hard time with a situation like this. Taking notes. So you guys put down a lot of things, and you think about this. These are the things you think they could be missing. Well, that's a lot of stuff to think about. So it might be easy to miss all that, just being one person. So yeah, perfect. Supply logistics and objectives needing to be met. Yeah. If this were a fire situation, they call it an incident within an incident, right? There's a lot of other things going on, including the medical itself. You track a time of day, super important one. Yep, other patients. Awesome.
Okay, so next, what do we do now?
So given some of those things, as a crew member, right, it's still important to think about maintaining your leadership. I'm not suggesting that you take over and start doing stuff. In fact, the opposite. One of the best things to think about in this situation is, well, I cannot create another problem for them to manage, right? Not going out and getting injured, not just maybe leaving the scene and not telling anybody where you're going and causing them to worry. So not creating the problem might be a good first step to think about. But what could you do to help? So you might think about your answer and remember the rest of the steps in your response too. What are some ideas that you have? Yeah, speak up. So those ideas might be a bit drawn out too, because it takes some steps. We got 2 on the board. Okay, great. Seen if folks had a hard time getting to the jam board. Share your opinion. Check in with other folks. Say, I really like that one. Simple, easy to do, low risk. Figure out who's in charge and share your observation, make suggestions. Ask questions. Yeah, good. Bring up the chain of command. All right. Chain of command helps keep things productive. So remind folks about how to stay in a productive mode. Have you put down some ideas here? Some of you may be familiar, and some maybe not. There's a new modules out for SAW classes called the Thinking Sawyer. Very similar examples in there to a lot of this. And they talk about how your brain reacts in some of these situations that can be high risk. And without diving fully into it, one thing they talk about is staying in team, taking some deep breaths. They call it belly breaths, right? Deep breaths allow you to stay in the frontal cortex, the ability to think and be effective rather than doing what's called switchbacking, going from flight or freeze to fight and then back again and reacting to the situation, allowing yourself to stay in that team mode and be an effective member. Another way to think about it is moving slow is moving fast. Sign roles, start thinking out, start looking for other patients, get on the radio. Yeah, agreed. A lot of these are awesome. Let's see here. One thing that we can get caught on here, though, is that the thrill of the moment, the emergency at hand, can cause us to go straight into implement. We got to remember the process, prototype. So I'll throw out an idea that I didn't see on there and talk about a prototype idea. So, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but let's say you go and talk to the lead and say, hey, I overheard you talking about needing a helicopter to get in here. How about I go look for one? Before you just run off and do it, you might tie in, communicate is what I saw on the Jamboard. And then instead of just running off and doing it, you might do a bunch of radio tests on the way. Can you communicate back and make sure that you know someone can hear you where you're at and you don't become another lost person or another problem for them to solve, right? Even in this moment is really important to set up a prototype and then test the prototype. I'm going to look this direction. I'm going to test it before I go all the way out, and then probably keep testing that you have communication or have a second person with you, right? So if something does go wrong, you have the ability to back it up and not have that become an issue. So even in this, I'll reiterate from the first one, thinking big, acting small, failing fast. You want those fails to be small and controlled so they're not creating another situation. And then testing it out, refining it, scaling it, maybe going, okay, there is no radio reception out there. Let's start over and think of a different way to accomplish this. See if someone else might have a map of nearby heli spots that they can feed into dispatch and then give us coordinates of, right? You'll only be able to think of this stuff if you stay in that team mode. You'll only be able to come up with these ideas and alternatives if you're in that team mode. If you're in fight or flight or freeze, then you won't be able to be as productive and helpful in this model. So come up with these ideas, prototype, test, gather the feedback from your manager and your peers. And if there's an opportunity right away, and then later on when things have cooled down too. So maybe there's so much going on in the moment, you focus on that moment and then you start implementing it later. But utilizing this model, you can start to see a little bit different than before, and can give you a chance for success that you might not have had before. Again, I just find it interesting that a lot of this is starting to revolve around the same concepts of staying in that team mode, allowing yourself the space to be you, not become an emergency yourself, and then be productive in that unit, even if the productivity is small, even if it's just talking with a person so that their nervousness about that medical situation or whatever it is, gets resolved even in that moment. So I'd love to hear back from folks about how they have interacted with this leadership, maybe being a follower to a leader or a leader themselves, or have thoughts or questions about this. And online and offline, if you want to get in contact and follow up too, be happy more to talk about this more. Because I imagine one day in the future, we'll be even refining this strategy with more ideas that we have.
Dylan, thanks for being willing to take on this project to put this together. I thought it was super interesting and really appreciate your time.